Well done. Great to be with you all tonight. Thank you for coming out. And thanks to Victoria and Stuart and the gang for arranging this. Yeah, I do quite a bit of work on Adam Smith, and this topic is a lecture I haven't given before. So it's been interesting preparing it, finding out about the Great Reset. Our title pits Adam Smith, perhaps the greatest, in my view, representative of liberalism. Perhaps we might have to clarify and say classical liberalism. Smith affirmed, as you know, I think, a presumption of liberty, captured, for example, in his words, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. He helped to coin the word liberal with a political meaning, to christen the word liberal with its first political meaning, and that was the core meaning for over 100 years. So Smithian liberalism is liberalism 1.0. His liberal posture in terms of this presumption of liberty, he talked about an ideal and he sketched out a kind of ideal, but his main attitude was directional, not destinational. We all live in a place, a time and place with a status quo, which deserves some respect. There's always a presumption of the status quo to some extent. And his idea was directional. Move towards more allowing people to pursue their own interests, their own way, upon the liberal plan of not messing with your neighbor's stuff, you know? Move in that direction. Fight things that push in that direction. He was against what I call the governmentalization of social affairs. The governmentalization captures not only restrictions on our liberty, on our voluntary association, on the use of our own property, not only those restrictions, including taxation, which is a coercive initiation of coercion against us, but also what all of that tax revenue and privilege creates on the government side. Big government players in society, which, you know, in the modern world now, drown us, smother us. I think he would have been appalled by the growth of government and the big role that government players, as educators, as funders, as employers, as benefactors, as you name it, play, because I think he didn't believe that government had good correction mechanisms the way private affairs, voluntary affairs had. So he was generally against the governmentalization. I mean, here again, both the restrictions and the big government that feeds off of that. And then I pit that against the Great Reset, which is a slogan, which is a phrase representing something certainly contrary, something anti-liberal, and something very clearly in favor, strongly in favor of governmentalization, as I'll show. So we have Smith, who's actually anti-governmentalization versus the Great Reset people, Axis, who are pro-governmentalization. Now, what do I know about the Great Reset? I don't know more than morbid curiosity, I guess you could say, about the World Economic Forum and about the videos that we get exposed to and the news and everything else. So I've not really tackled it in a systematic way, or the influence that those players, his young leaders and so forth, have played around the world, although I see what's happening. What I've done is I've carefully read this book. It came out in 2020. It's by Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malloret. The bios here say that Schwab is founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. Malloret holds a PhD in econ, works for the WEF. The bio says that he worked in the Prime Minister's office in France for 3 years And quote, he has written several business and academic books and published 4 novels. He lives in Chamonix, France. To sum up the underlying message of this book, which is not their words and is not stated even in other words quite this way, but is my words, my reading of the underlying message of this book, it is knuckle under or we will hurt you. Knuckle under or we will hurt you. That is the underlying message of this book. Now, if you don't know American idiom or English idiom, knuckle under means, of course, submitting to domination and invokes a posture of getting on all fours, knuckles to the ground. The we is some undefined regime or an axis of anti-liberals like the authors. The book is an act of intimidation. It describes growing governmentalization. It advocates governmentalization. And it communicates, obey us or get hurt. Knuckle under or we will hurt you. The book is not only profoundly anti-liberal politically, it's also illiberal in its manner of discoursing. The whole manner is dishonest. I'd say the book is highly disagreeable to any dignified and self-respecting reader. It's a book of intimidation and bullying, and its appeal would be to readers who enjoy bullying and intimidation, especially of others, seeing others be bullied and rooting the bullies on, but perhaps even in some strange way of themselves. It also takes the form of gaslighting, if you know that expression in English. Gaslighting is the sowing of lies, deception, and confusion so the bullies can take advantage of the fog of confusion to assert themselves as the only focal way forward for social action. It's a sort of propaganda or psychological warfare. So I'll say why I think the book is dishonest and illiberal, but you might first be asking yourself, what is the Great Reset? That's a good question. The book doesn't come out and make that clear by any means at the front of the book, or even by the end of the book, you might say. And that's, it's not like they say, we clearly specify the issues and the position here. It's got challengers or rivals over here of other positions, and then we're going to argue honestly for it. It's really not what they do at all. As I say, I think the underlying message is knuckle under or we will hurt you. Anyway, I'll share some quotations at the front. They say this book, COVID-19, The Great Reset, is an attempt to identify and shed light on the changes ahead. So that sounds descriptive, like we're narrating what's happening. And to make a modest contribution in terms of delineating what their more desirable and sustainable form might resemble. So it's also an agenda to some extent, but they make it sound very secondary and modest at the beginning. In about the middle of the book, they say the young generation is firmly at the vanguard of social change. There is little doubt that it, the young generation, will be the catalyst for change and a source of critical momentum for the Great Reset. But then at the end of the book, and here I think I've got, let me see here. I apologize for this, I'm supposed to be. So there's the book that I'm holding up. They tell of replacing failed ideas, institutions, processes, and rules with new ones better suited to current and future needs. This is the essence of the Great Reset. So what is their idea of better? They really make no bones about it. It's greater governmentalization throughout society. They project it in all manner of ways. You could probably guess ESG, control of business, surveillance and tracking, government financing, government favor and disfavor, big government everywhere, really. I infer, they don't say this, but I infer that they look forward, they the authors, but I guess Schwab is the more primary figure here. to a one-party state like the CCP in China that crushes dissent and usurps free and fair democracy. They don't say that, but everything they advocate would spell that, just as Tocqueville actually warned us of in Democracy in America. And it's hard not to believe that they don't see that as well. The difference from the CCP in China, however, is the globalitarian flavor of the Great Reset. They imagine organizations like the World Health Organization on the stage, and presumably their anti-liberal globalitarian network behind the scenes. It often points to globalitarian answers. It doesn't use the word globalitarian, of course. And Schwab basically acts like a ringleader of this globalitarian network, even though he is not a government official and, as far as I know, has never been elected to anything. And that kind of vagueness and lack of forthrightness, again, I think reflects a sort of contempt for honest bottom-up democracy and for freedom. By the way, this quotation you see here demonstrates the shabby nature of the reasoning of the book. The Great Reset is defined as replacing failed institutions with better ones. They build betterness into the definition of the Great Reset. They never justify the betterness. They never really mount arguments at all, formulate questions and challenges at all. They merely assert their positions and the betterness of them. Their reasoning really throughout is a sham and a fraud. I mean, it's scarcely reasoning at all. Yeah, so they never, as I say, clearly formulate vying positions and honestly argue for them. Let me talk a little bit about this conclusion or something near the end of the book where they set up a kind of contrast. Resetting, as they've been advocating, is an ambitious task, but we have no choice but to try our utmost. It's about making the world less decisive, less polluting, etc. There's that. Doing nothing or too little is to sleepwalk towards more social inequality, economic imbalances, injustice, environmental degradation. Failing to act would equate to letting our world become meaner, more divided, more dangerous, more selfish, and more unbearable. To do nothing is not. So it's to do nothing or it's the Great Reset. That's like the vying positions they're considering here. And I think, they figure that we want a world with less meanness, division, danger, and degradation. But they never really argue that they're saying, and this really flies in the face of Adam Smith. Let me show you one more quotation before I get a little bit to Adam Smith. They say, the more nationalism and isolationism pervade the global polity, the greater the chance that global governance loses its relevance and becomes ineffective. Sadly, we are now at this critical juncture. Put bluntly, we live in a world in which nobody is really in charge. Now, there are three things about this passage. The first is global polity. They may not have noticed, but there is no global polity. They just presuppose global polity. I wonder who these global governors are. I guess it's these ones who are giving the orders in this book and saying, knuckle under or we will hurt you. That's the first absurdity. The second absurdity is that there is no way to put anyone in charge of any kind of global system. And the third absurdity is that it wouldn't be desirable to do so. And they don't, tackle any of these obvious challenges to what they're saying here. So when Smith speaks of his ideas about politics, this is a rather famous passage about the system of natural liberty. He's considered all systems either of preference or restraint, and those thus taken away because he's criticized those. The obvious and simple system of natural liberty establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice And that's the narrow sense of justice of not messing with your neighbor's stuff. Person, property, promises due. Not messing. Is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest, his own way. There's that expression again, at another critical moment in the wealth of nations, and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with other men. The sovereign is discharged from a duty, the attempting to perform which he must always be exposed to innumerable delusions, and for the proper performance of which no human wisdom or knowledge could ever be sufficient, namely the duty of superintending the industry of private people. Well, anyway, this expression of numerable delusions up here might make you think of Klaus Schwab. And there's another passage in Smith which is famous and might make you think of him, and that's his criticism of the man of system. This is from the Theory of Moral Sentiments. The man of system is apt to be very wise in his own conceit and is so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it. He goes on to establish it completely and in all its parts without any regard either to the great interest or to the strong prejudices which may oppose it. He seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces upon the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon it. And then he goes on to say that in fact, human beings not only have their own knowledge and opportunities and abilities, but they even have their own individual principles of motion, like we're all uniquely motivated. And so, is the man of system a good description of Schwab? I don't know. It could be that rather than actually having this vision that he really believes in, this system, he is rather consumed by vanity and wickedness and does not really have any great faith in what he advocates. There's so much cynicism, it seems to me, in this that I almost doubt whether he really believes in system. I'm reluctant to say. Adam Smith suggests that the most important task of government really is to guard against human wickedness. And that's partly guarding against people who would mess with their neighbor's stuff, but I think that's also about limited government and constraints on government and keeping up the integrity and constitutional rule of law of government. The fatal effects of bad government arise from nothing but that it does not sufficiently guard against the mischiefs which human wickedness give occasion to. I don't know what motivates Klaus Schwab: greed, selfishness, vanity, misanthropy, a lust for domination and deception, wickedness, I don't know. All those things get balled up together under massive self-delusion in the crooked timber of humanity. All I can say is that I think you can often tell these kinds of things from the manner in which a person discourses. All right, now let me speak a little more broadly and generally about Adam Smith and why he represents a statement, a symbol of a whole tradition, a whole vast civilizational tradition, the gem of Western civilization, which the Great Reset and all the other anti-liberals throughout history, whether you want to think of the Russian Revolution or the Hitler or the French Revolution or the Maoist Cultural Revolution, have gone to war with. And I'm inclined to put the Great Reset in this broadly in this category. Smith's ethics, first of all, are patterned after benevolent monotheism, and thus he maintains the ethical framework of the Christendom in which he wrote. Christendom developed, in the last 500 years, you might say, nation states, first with absolutism, but by virtue of teachings represented by Smith and his predecessors, teachings of jurisprudence and moral philosophy, a more liberal sort of nation state, that is to say, not just an absolutist nation state. The wars of religion, this was after the printing press, taught Christendom that in modern society, government could no longer tend and lead the higher things in people's lives. We all in our own life have our more sacred things, which give us an enduring sense of self, meaning, purpose, cohesion, connection, love. Those are higher things that are just kind of what we identify as and are about. Each of us has those, everybody, okay? And maybe some aren't as high as other people's, or you think they're not so good higher things, but everybody has higher and lower things, higher and more mundane or profane things in their lives. And it used to be in traditional society and in our longer past that we did this together collectively, and there was leadership and commonality and integration, shared understanding and integration of the higher and the lower. The printing press really broke this wide open. As people then, with printing started to publish different interpretations of scripture, of the world, of morality, of society, of politics. And then you got these competing visions and, sense-making of higher things, of the meaning of life, of the worthiness of things, of virtue. And so, and then we got the wars of religion where different religions, because you now had secession, Protestants fighting with each other and Protestants fighting with Catholics. Of course, it wasn't just wars of religion that, the 30 Years' War was about, but it's a big factor. And so out of all this brutality and catastrophe, this liberal idea arose. A liberal kind of solution arose. Let me just see where I am in my notes here. I want to come back to what the thing. I just want to say, make a remark. I think I want to move to this picture here. See, this is sort of like the higher things. The great chain of being had a sense of integration in traditional society. You could think of before the printing press. And then they, tried to sustain this when they had the competing churches that then went to war with each other. And that led to tremendous catastrophe. And we developed the idea of religious toleration, the freedom of speech. And the idea that what we need to do is agree on certain basic rules, basic social grammars of not messing with each other's stuff. And the government, rather than leading and tending the higher things, would secure the lower things and let us then pursue our own higher things separately, as long as we kept within the bounds, just like Smith said in the quote I read, of justice. And so we no longer expected to have the same higher things exactly. We accepted the modern world, okay? And we got on, and they built a philosophy of this, and Smith is the pinnacle. Smith's philosophy, that is, I would say, is the pinnacle of this whole movement. What you've got here is this precise and accurate commutative justice, and then other forms of justice, distributive justice. That just means making a becoming use of your own. That's not the welfare state distributive justice. That's you distributing your own stuff justly, and that's estimative justice, estimating objects properly. And you can kind of associate this with life, liberty. That's like person, property, promises due, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the genius of the United States in many respects. It kind of codifies this liberal solution. Let me just say that wokeism is a rejection of modern civilization. What it does is it wants to sort of prohibit dissent on higher things. It wants to say, if you don't agree, you're violating me. You're doing a microaggression just because what you say offends me, and so on and so forth. And so wokeism and all forms of fanatical anti-liberalism want to actually roll back this whole great development that Smith is kind of the cap of. It came out of the 17th and 18th centuries especially, from jurisprudence and political theory. I can, And so we got, with this emphasis on the basic thing, like I said, and not only were we not to mess with each other's stuff, there developed the liberals who said, you know what, the government, we recognize the government's a special player. It's not just another player, like Murray Rothbard says. They reject that. They say government is a special player and we accord it a special standing, and we recognize that basically initiating coercion is part of the definition of government and that it's basically an inevitable reality. But the government too is encouraged not to mess with the governed's stuff, a presumption of liberty. And if they're going to restrict liberty, they ought to give a really good cause. They bear the burden of proof. That's what a presumption's about, like the presumption of innocence, right? And that's what Smith and folks like that built and actually persuaded aristocrats of, and we actually had a liberal era and the glory of that. So they said, yeah, we've got these nation states, let's make them liberal nation states. And they, as I said, christened this political outlook liberal in the 1770s, and that was liberalism 1.0. He suggests a very limited role for government because he knew that government necessarily lacked the knowledge to do good. That's not the only reason, though. It lacked the incentives to correct its errors. In fact, government has many pathological incentives which prompt it to do evil. From all sides, moral, economic, cultural, political, Smith generally leaned against governmentalization. Smith knew that as organizations became larger, more centralized and top-down, they became more corrupt. His ideal system of natural liberty, besides leaving people alone and enforcing night watchman functions for that commutative justice, suggested only basic infrastructure services and perhaps limited government involvement in education. Characteristic of his approach was local independent control, independent finances based on user fees like tolls, voluntary contributions, and only perhaps and sometimes local taxation. He believed in what the Catholics call subsidiarity or decentralization. Not only do locals have better knowledge and ability to do good, they have less power to do widespread evil, which, remember, is the real fatal effects of bad government, the wickedness of mankind. He would be adamantly opposed to globalitarianism. He knew that moral obligation was naturally grown from the bottom up. Like Edmund Burke spoke of little platoons teaching us our duties, starting with ourselves, our family, our communities, our friendships, and up to the nation. Smith has this passage about the focus on home. The administration of the great system of the universe, the care of the universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weaknesses of his powers and the narrowness of his comprehension, the care of his own happiness, his family, his friends, his country. No way would he have any time for the globalitarians. Without organic roots, government is even more of a sham and a menace than it is when it does have organic roots. And as the supranational institutions around us today, WHO, UN, and others, Brussels, consistently demonstrate, they are so often a sham and a menace. Smith would stand with national sovereignty dead set against the globalitarians. So the liberal solution was a brilliant one. The liberty implies free enterprise, and Smith morally authorized this freedom. First of all, he morally authorized entrepreneurs to pursue honest income, invigorating economic life and especially innovation. And Smith edified policymakers towards liberalization, and in this moral philosophy kind of way, he helped bring about this moral authorization created the great enrichment, and it's a very dramatic thing. And then for most of the 19th century, Europe enjoyed a time of relative peace. But unfortunately, at the end of the 19th century, anti-liberalism surged. Anti-liberals then, like Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Mao, tried to impose big government, as though, again, turning back modern society, pretending that by governmentalizing, someone could, as Schwab and Mallory dream, be really in charge. Someone really in charge could once again lead and tend to higher things throughout society. This hallucination appeals for foolish people who have not made their peace with the modern world. And these leaders are frauds and despots. We got big government in the 20th century. We got world wars, misery, and dehumanization. But prior to that, there was this liberal arc in Europe, an arc rising out of Christianity, high from about 1776 to 1876, and it was the liberal era. And our remnant liberalism is once again under severe assault by anti-liberals. I'd say our job, if I don't want to speak for you, but if I can presume, is to make Europe liberal again. Mela, make Europe liberal again. To do that, we must teach the anti-liberals the folly of their ways and persuade fellow human beings against anti-liberalism, and so on. So I do want to spend some time. I hope I'm not taking, what time we're supposed to, I'm really behind. I want to just flash at least. These guys use the word, so now I want to share some, I got a whole bunch of quotes, which I'm not going to be able to read, but they're there. The proof is right there. These guys use the word will a lot. This will happen, that will happen. Like they know what's going to happen. Small businesses will suffer disproportionately. Many will not survive. Big businesses will get bigger, while the smallest shrink or disappear. But then they talk so much about governmentalization will happen. And they keep saying it in all these different areas. I've put the word will in bold here just to see their style of projection, prophecy. Again, sort of like psychological warfare. And it goes on, and it's about governmentalization just throughout labor markets, about everything that has to do with the environment, just in every direction, really. And this is what so much of the book consists of. Nowhere will this intrusion of government manifest itself with greater vigor than in the redefinition of the social contract. So it's not just micromanaging things. They have this very grandiose philosophical view in the spirit of a Rousseau or a Karl Marx. On the dial that measures the continuum between the government and the markets, the needle has decisively moved to the left. So this goes on and on. I just want to show you how much there is here that we could look at. I know we don't have time. Here's ESG stuff, which of course is going to be a tool for favoring and disfavoring, for basically, like I say, knuckle under or we will hurt you. Tech and surveillance is a big part of that as well. They talk about tracking us, globalizing this, keeping records. In banking, it's about being prepared for the digital transformation. They don't specifically speak of central bank digital currency, but it fits their whole profile. And then there's the globalitarian element. The absolute prerequisite is for a proper reset. The absolute prerequisite for a proper reset is greater collaboration and cooperation between countries. That is, shared intentionality to act towards a common goal. So they're kind of presuming or envisioning some kind of global polity like they spoke of. Progress will only come about through improved global governance. WHO is the only organization capable of coordinating a global response to the pandemic. The word reset itself really says a lot. They never talk about, the dictionary definition of reset, but when you think about it, it's not setting back to an initial state that they're talking about. It's not setting like a stopwatch. I reset my stopwatch to 0. It's really this third one, to set or position differently. And they've got really a whole agenda and movement. I don't know what to call it, aggressive revolutionary sort of thing. But anyway, let me move forward. At the beginning of the book, they say something remarkable. They really emphasize that the macro reset will occur in the context of the 3 prevailing secular forces that shape our world today: interdependence, velocity, and complexity. And they say because things are so interdependent, governments have to take over, essentially. And given that they don't treat this concept of like, well, gee, maybe that's a non sequitur, maybe people have addressed this, it's like they think they are discovering something here. You might expect them to be ready to say this next quote. It would almost fit in with the book. We were the first to assert that the more complicated the forms assumed by civilization, the more restricted the freedom of the individual must become. But they weren't the ones who said that. Does anyone know who said that? Anyone want to take a guess? We were the first to assert that the more complicated the form, this is exactly, what the book is getting at. More complicated the forms assumed by civilization, the more restricted the freedom of the individual must become. It was Benito Mussolini who said that. And this is quoted by Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. And like I say, Hayek is in the tradition of Smith, and the whole gem of Western civilization is teaching that in a complex world, you have to let things happen more on their own. You have to let those who have the knowledge and responsibility and incentives to serve those whom they affect, serve them. And to learn from that and to face the feedback of that. The price signals in the market, the profit and loss system in the market, the moral feedback in the moral community in a voluntary society. And that's the spontaneous invisible hand idea that is the whole, they act like that never even happened. They just say this at the beginning of the book as though this means, like they just wrote the whole liberal arc out of all of our cultural experience. It's really just extraordinary. So Smith makes other arguments about why governmentalization is bad. And one goes to the Pinky and the Earthquake thought experiments. Maybe you've heard about it from the Theory of Moral Sentiments, but I'm running out of time. We could maybe come back to that. So let me just say that we're once again under a very serious assault. I mean, we've always been under a constant assault, but we all know that the last several years have been something special, and I really do think a super special challenge, kind of watershed challenge. And these kind of folks, these kind of anti-liberals, we're not all alike. We have different higher things that mean things to us. And some of us might call ourselves conservatives, libertarians, traditionalists, constitutionalists, classical liberals. But, Lord of the Rings, Mordor took on the elves and the dwarves and the humans and the ents and the eagles. And if the adversaries of Mordor do not coalesce, you know, I'm concerned that Mordor will continue to encroach, and Tocqueville's nightmare, you know, may just be realized. But there's a truth to all of what Smith taught and Hayek taught, and that, of course, that's why we call it the truth. There's a power to it, and the power, I'm sorry, is why we call it the truth. And that, of course, reality does hit back, and it also makes sense to people, reality, and it's going to continue to make sense to people and young people, and, you know, vitality will, so things are going to continue to evolve, but yeah, we've got quite a challenge facing us. Thank you for your attention.